Hello, everybody. This is Empowering Democracy. I'm your host, Joe Firestone. Our topics for tonight are the first one is empathy, why empathy is so very important in international affairs. Our second topic is yawning through genocide. And our third is the national debt and sustainability. What kind of sustainability? Well, maybe many different kinds of sustainability, but not fiscal sustainability. Anyway, we'll get into that far more deeply. So Dee says, hello, everyone. She has problems with her Wi-Fi and is trying to join. So Dee Pierce, the host of Around the World with Dee and Friends, may be here if she resolves her Wi-Fi problems. I may be here too if I solve my very sudden throat problems. And there's Steve Wolfbrandt. Hello, Steve. Great to see you. So let's begin with Scott Ritter's piece, on empathy. Very well written, very interesting piece. It's entitled In Search of Empathy, and it was written on Christmas Day. Very industrious of Scott. And here's a picture of Reich Marshal Hermann Goering being sentenced for war crimes in Nuremberg, September 30th, 1946. And if I'm not mistaken, sitting right next to him is Rudolf Hess. And there are a number of guards there. Those look like what they're wearing is U.S. uniforms. In my work with the defendants at the Nuremberg trials of Nazis after World War II, this is a quote, I was searching for the nature of evil, and I now think I have come close to defining it. A lack of empathy. It's the one characteristic that connects all the defendants, the genuine incapacity to feel with their fellow men. Evil, I think, is the absence of empathy, unquote. That quote is from Captain G.M. Gilbert, U.S. Army psychologist, author of the Nuremberg Diary. Scott Ritter goes on. In September 1995, I was working for the United Nations Special Commission, UNSCOM, UNSCOM, charged with eliminating Iraqi weapons of mass destruction. I was the primary liaison between UNSCOM and Israeli intelligence at the time, and I would make frequent trips to Israel, which could last between a few days and a few weeks, During one of these visits, I invited my wife, uh, um, 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 uh, uh, Marina, to join me over the weekend. She is a devout Georgian Orthodox Christian and was thrilled about the opportunity to see the Holy Land firsthand. We walked the Via della Rosa, unquote, the quote, sorrowful way, unquote, in Jerusalem, tracing Jesus' journey to his crucifixion. We dipped our feet in the River Jordan at the spots John was said to have baptized Jesus. We toured the Sea of Galilee, visiting the various sites of the ministry of Jesus as recorded in the Bible. All these experiences resonated deeply with us both. But it was the excursion my wife made to Yad Vashem, the World Holocaust Remembrance Center, located on Mount Herzl in western Jerusalem. It made the deepest impression. It was there. It was there that Marina came face to face with photographs of some of the child victims of the Holocaust. She'd given birth to our twin daughters in February 1993. At the time of her visit to Yad Vashem, our girls were 2.5 years old, the same age as some of the children in the photographs on display at the center. She saw our daughters in the eyes of these children and immediately broke down and cried. She was overcome with empathy. In the summer of 1997, I found myself in Baghdad at the head of an inspection team whose purpose it was to confront the Iraqi government with its inconsistent and often contradictory information about the disposition of weapons of mass destruction related materials in the summer of 1991. Armed with defector reports and satellite imagery, I had been able to find caches of unaccounted missile production equipment and unravel the deceit of senior Iraqi officials that had served as the foundation of their narrative for more than 6 years running. My inspection team was not very popular among the inner circle of Iraqi President Saddam Hussein. As a means of putting pressure on me and my team, the Iraqi government would air video clips of our inspection, accusing me and the other inspectors of working for the CIA and blaming us for the ongoing suffering of the Iraqi people at the hands of Western sanctions. This led to several death threats and at least one attempted assassination attempt on me and my team by disgruntled Iraqi civilians who took the accusations of the Iraqi government to heart. Rather than back down or hide, my team and I took the opposite approach. We made our presence in Iraq as high profile as possible, part of my, quote, alpha dog, unquote, approach to inspecting, which had us figuratively, quote, pissing on the walls, unquote, of Iraq in order to leave our mark and to make sure the Iraqis knew who was in charge when it came to the implementation of our mandate. And in this picture, the author walks next to his Onscom Nissan patrol vehicle at the UN headquarters in the summer of 1992. You notice how trim and svelte Scott was in the summer of 1997. At night, when the inspections were finished, and while the quiet, quote, news of our efforts were being broadcast on Iraqi television, my team and I would drive to the center of town in our ubiquitous Nissan Patrol SUVs with the black, quote, the UN, unquote, letters painted on the sides and our tactical markings displayed on the roofs and hoods in gray duct tape. These were the team designations for each vehicle. An A1 for, quote, Alpha 1, unquote. My vehicle was marked with a W, quote unquote, for, quote, a whiskey, unquote. We would park on the side of the road next to whatever restaurant we had picked to dine in that night and walk in with all the cockiness of John Wayne and his cowboys. Indeed, the head of the UN humanitarian mission in Iraq had recently called us, quote, cowboys, unquote, in an interview he gave for Le Monde. We decided the title, which was meant to be an insult, fit us well. One night, as we sat in a popular roast chicken establishment, the television started playing a, quote, news special, unquote, which singled me out for attack. The inspectors and I watched the crowd as they watched a TV screen where our photographs were displayed along with the running narrative of our many, quote, crimes, unquote. The mood in the restaurant darkened considerably, and someone recommended that we leave while the leaving was good. Quote, no, unquote, I countered. Quote, we paid for this meal and we're going to enjoy it. Fuck these people, unquote. That's Scott, of course. I was in no mood for showing weakness. We had just spent a day parked outside the Iraqi intelligence headquarters with our entry blocked by armed guards. At one point, we were ushered inside the guardhouse while the police disarmed a man who were driven by with a loaded AK-47, intent on gunning me and the inspectors down. No sooner than these words had left my mouth, I saw a woman rise from her seat at a table to our front. She was dressed in a black dress with a black shawl covering her head. Someone at her table tried to pull her back to her seat, but she reprimanded them and they let go of her arm. She turned and made her way toward my table. Her eyes locked on mine. Quote, a boss, unquote, one of the inspectors, a grizzled British soldier, said, quote, incoming, unquote. Quote, I got her, unquote, I replied. I watched her closely as she drew near me, my gaze fluctuating from her eyes and her hands, trying to ascertain her intent. I hadn't reached a conclusion by the time she halted, standing over me as I sat there and wiped the chicken grease from my face with a napkin. Quote, you are Scott Ritter, unquote, she asked, her voice cracking with emotion. Quote, yes, ma'am, unquote, I said, coming to my feet. Quote, and these are your men, your inspectors, unquote? Quote, yes, ma'am, unquote, I replied. Quote, I see you on television every day. They say it is you I should blame for the death of my children, unquote. Quote, yes, ma'am, unquote. I stuttered, not knowing what else to say. Quote, they want me to hate you, unquote. Quote again, yes, ma'am, unquote. She stared at me, tears welling in her eyes. Her hands were wrapped in her shawl, and suddenly one darted out. If it had been a knife, she would have been able to stab me. But it was just her hand that she laid on my arm. Quote, "You are doing your job," unquote, she said. Quote, "I know this. I know in your heart you mean me no harm. I know in your heart that you did not want my child to die," unquote. Tears started trickling down her cheek. Quote, "I know you are someone's son. That all of you," unquote, she said, gesturing to the hard men seated around the table, quote, "have mothers who love you as I loved my child," unquote. She looked up at me, quote, "I will pray for your safety so that you can finish your work and that sanctions can be lifted so other mothers do not lose their children to disease," unquote. She squeezed my arm and turned away, heading back to her table, where she sat down and sank her head into the arms of the lady seated next to her, sobbing. I looked down at my unfinished meal, no longer hungry. Quote, "Let's go," unquote, I said, the anger and cockiness that had defined my earlier tone gone. We left, each of us reaching into our pockets to leave as large a tip as possible, as if we all were trying to atone for our sins by buying forgiveness. The crowd in the restaurant let us leave without incident. As I sat in the Nissan Patrol heading back to our headquarters building, where I would finish the daily inspection report, I could still feel the grip of the lady on my arm where she had squeezed me. I tried to figure out why she did what she did. She had every right to hate us. I know that if I was coming face to face with the man responsible for the death of my children, the meeting would not be described as peaceful. But she chose peace. She did so in a very public manner, singling me out for the entire restaurant to see. I wonder what would have happened if she hadn't stood up, if she hadn't confronted me. What would the crowd have done? I had been caught in several public settings, including a restaurant, when the mood of the crowd soured. Things got real ugly real fast. But her intervention prevented that. She intervened to protect us because she was a mother. And she knew that we had uh, um, from others. She had been overcome, with empathy. Earlier this year, I had the opportunity to visit the Donbass region of Russia, including the city of Luhansk. Once part of Ukraine, these territories were caught up in the turmoil that gripped Ukraine following the coming to power in Kiev of anti-Russian Ukrainian nationalists following the U.S. orchestrated Maidan revolt of February 2014. The Russian-speaking population of the Donbass revolted against the new Ukrainian nationalists who sought to impose a sort of cultural genocide by banning the Russian language, religion, culture, and history. The revolt that followed lasted nearly 8 years, culminating in the Russian military intervention in Ukraine and the subsequent annexation of 4 former Ukrainian regions, or oblasts, including the two, Donetsk and Luhansk, which together form the Donbass. There is a monument. It's a memorial to the children of the Luhansk region. It's in Luhansk, in what is now Russia. While in Luhansk, I was taken to a memorial dedicated to the children of Luhansk who perished in the fighting that has been raging since 2014. When the monument was installed back in 2018, there were 33 angels depicted, one for each Luhansk child had perished in the fighting. Since that time, 35 additional Luhansk children have perished, raising the total number killed to 68. What struck me when visiting the memorial was how each child's life resonated with the citizens of Luhansk, as if everyone in the city claimed the lost children as their own. I'd witnessed this phenomenon before. Back in 2000, I visited Iraq for the purpose of filming a documentary on ONSCOM and the disarmament of Iraq. While there, I visited the site of the Martyrs Place Elementary School, where on the morning of October 13, 1987, an Iranian Scud missile strike killed 22 children and injured more than 160 others as they gathered in the school playground to start the day. At the entrance of the playground was a memorial depicting 22 bronze angels ascending to heaven. At the time of my visit to Baghdad, some 13 years after the attack, the residents of the neighborhood surrounding the school were still emotional over the loss of life among the children. Quote, "They would be young adults today," unquote, one elderly man said, quote, "just starting their lives," unquote. It is the loss of the children that hits a community hardest. Whether in Luhansk, Baghdad, or Malot, a town in Israel, where in May 1974 Palestinian militants occupied the Netiv Meir Elementary School, where they took some 115 persons hostage, 105 of whom were children. The Israeli military stormed the building, killing the 3 Palestinian gunmen, as well as 31 hostages, 22 of whom were children. Israelis were still talking about the village Cave Malot when I visited in 1995, some 21 years later. Some things cannot be forgotten. And even though I was not a witness to any of these events, as a father of twin daughters, I felt the pain of those who lost their little ones, as if the lives lost were my own flesh and blood, because I had a sense of empathy. If the lack of empathy is the principal characteristic of evil, then the ability to empathize must be the trademark of good. The Christmas season finds the world engulfed in conflict, with tragedy playing out before our eyes daily. We won't be human if we start to become immune to the horror. Our senses overwhelmed by the repetitive scenes of death and destruction that we are constantly confronted by. Being physically separated from violence, we have the option to tune out the unpleasant sights and sounds of human suffering. After all, how many times can we see the torn, lifeless body of a child pulled from the rubble of Gaza and Beirut, or from the wreckage of homes in Ukraine and Russia? Overdosing from senseless tragedy leads to the numbing of our soul, the hardening of our heart, the diminishment of our humanity. But we must endure. We must endure. For no other reason than to make sure that those young lives lost did not perish in vain. We must learn and remember the names of those who have perished, not to serve as fuel for the furnace of hatred that drives no one to seek revenge, but because we have a duty as humans to put ourselves in the shoes of those who have lost their loved ones in war, to feel their pain, to understand their loss, so that we know the importance of trying to bring the violence that took these lives to an end. War is never the solution. Peace is always the answer. I often think back to my encounter with the Iraqi mother at the restaurant in Baghdad. It was an ugly time in my life when I was overcome with a sense of duty that clouded my own humanity. I was so singularly focused on the task at hand, disarming Iraq, that I forgot there was a human cost associated with my work and that of my inspectors. I told the story of this encounter a few times, but I always left out one part of the story, because the memory of it rips at my heart to this day. After the lady squeezed my arm and started to turn away, I reached out and laid my hand on her shoulder. She spun around and looked at me. Quote, "What was your child's name?" Unquote. I asked. Her eyes filled with tears, but she smiled slightly before answering. Quote, Zainab, unquote, she said. Quote, Zainab, unquote, I repeated. Quote, it's a beautiful name, unquote. Quote, she was a beautiful child, unquote, the mother replied. I don't tell this part of the story because it takes away from the tough guy, alpha dog persona I had developed during that time. Because when she turned and walked away, she left me standing alone, sobbing. But we must confront these things. Zainab would have been in her late 20s today, old enough to have found love, probably married, and began a child of her own. But it wasn't to be. We must remember Zainab, just as we remember every child whose life was taken from this earth too soon. We must empathize with those who have lost their loved ones because of the senseless wars fought by men. We must make sure that the children who are alive today have the chance to grow up and raise families of their own. Otherwise, we become the tools of evil, if not evil itself. And then he wishes us, a Merry Christmas. I'm not going to play the video from Scott's program here. It's also a very touching video. and very appropriate for Christmas. And I commend it to all of you, as I commend his article. You should read it for yourself. It's hard to come away from it without your empathy overcoming you. And that's as much as I have to say about it. Except that we should always choose peace if we have the chance to choose peace over war. I will look at your comments. I have forgotten to share this. I guess Dee hasn't been able to overcome her technical problems. I neglected to share this on Facebook earlier, but I'm going to share it now. And now I'll consider your comments. Steve Wolfbrand says, hello, everybody. Steve says, hello, shared. Steve says, hi, Dee. Steve says, watch the telepathy tapes. Thank you, Steve. I remember George W. laughing about the WMDs and searching behind his desk. I don't remember that, but George W. was someone who could have used a lot of empathy, I think. Gada Fadl Abad said, she leaves a link to her GoFundMe. Could you help me by donating and share? I have Crohn's disease, a chronic condition characterized by symptoms such as severe diarrhea and significant bleeding. Due to dietary lack, she mostly consumes canned foods, particularly canned peas, which has further aggravated my health. Frequently experiences intense abdominal pain and bleeding, leading to a substantial weight loss and posing a serious risk to it. I haven't taken my medication for the past 6 months, despite. Steve says we are all doing our job. Jeffrey Denton says happy holidays, Dee, Steve, and Firestones. Yeah, I would say Merry Christmas, but Christmas has passed. So happy holidays it is. Steve says Happy New Year, Jeffrey. May it be better than the past. May we get the Medicare for All bill through in spite of all the odds against it in 2025. Evelina Pond says evil is a lack of empathy, and so is apathy. Speaking of those who yawn during genocide, or yawn through genocide, yes. And that, if you would, please share, like, and subscribe this. I think it's an important stream, even though I know people have much else to do in this period of the year. I'll now share the screen for our second article, which is about yawning through genocide. It's by Jonathan Cook. It's from the UN's Review. And the title is Another Expert Report Finds Israel is Committing Genocide. The West yawns. This is a lengthy piece, but an important one. So here is someone who's mourning over the death of someone else, covered by a blanket. We can't tell if it's a father mourning a child. That wouldn't be surprising. But that information is not in the caption. Caption says Amnesty, Human Rights Watch, and Médecins Sans Frontières, which is Doctors Without Borders in English, are all agreed. But the Gaza genocide is now just another routine news item buried on the inside pages. 3 separate reports published this month by leading international human rights and medical groups have detailed the same horrifying story: that Israel is well advanced in its genocide of the Palestinian population in Gaza. Or to be more accurate, they have confirmed what was already patently clear, that for the past 14 months, Israel has been slaughtering tens of thousands of Palestinians with indiscriminate weapons, while at the same time gradually starving the survivors to death and denying them access to medical care. Genocides can happen with gas chambers or with machetes, or they can be carried out with 2,000-pound bombs and aid blockades. Genocides rarely look the same, but they are all designed to arrive at the same endpoint: the elimination of a people. Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and Médecins Sans Frontières, MSF, agree that Israel is striving for extermination. It has not hidden its intent, and that intent is confirmed by its actions on the ground. Only the willfully blind, which includes Western politicians and their media, are still in denial. But worse than denial, they continue to actively collude in this, the ultimate crime against humanity, by supplying Israel with the weapons, intelligence, and diplomatic cover it needs for the extermination. Last week, MSF issued its report titled "Life in the Death Trap That is Gaza," concluding that Israel was intentionally, quote, unraveling the fabric of society, unquote. The medical charity observed, quote, the violence unleashed by Israeli forces has caused physical and mental damage on a scale that would overwhelm any functioning health system, let alone one already decimated by a crushing offensive and a 17-year-long blockade by Israel, unquote. MSF added, even if the offensive ended today, its long-term impact would be unprecedented given the scale of destruction, unquote. Rebuilding the society and dealing with the health consequences will, quote, span generations, unquote. Intention proven. MSF's findings followed hot on the heels of a 185-page report by Human Rights Watch, which concluded that Israel was committing, quote, acts of genocide, unquote. The organization limited its focus to one of Israeli policy, its systematic effort to deprive the population of access to water, a clear measure of intentionality, the critical yardstick for judging whether mass killing has crossed into genocide. At a news conference, Lama Faki, HRW's Middle East director, said the research had proved Israel was, quote, intentionally killing Palestinians in Gaza by denying them the water that they need to survive, unquote. Israel had done so in 4 coordinated moves. It had blocked pipelines supplying water from outside Gaza. It had then cut off power to run the pumps that Gaza's own supplies from wells and desalination plants depended on. Next, it had destroyed the solar panels that were the backup to deal with such power cuts. And finally, it had killed crews trying to repair the supply system and aid agency staff trying to bring in water supplies. Quote, this is a comprehensive policy preventing people from getting any water, unquote. HRW's acting Israel and Palestine director Bill Van Esveld concluded. He added that the group had made, quote, a very clear finding of extermination, unquote. Quote, a pattern of conduct, unquote. HRW echoed a much wider-ranging report by Amnesty International, the world's best-known international human rights organization. In a 296-page report published in early December, Amnesty concluded that Israel had been, quote, brazenly, continuously, unquote, committing genocide in Gaza or, quote, unleashing hell, unquote, as the organization phrased it more graphically. The period of Amnesty's research ended in July, 5 months ago. Since then, Israel has further intensified its destruction of northern Gaza to drive out the population. Nonetheless, Amnesty described a, quote, pattern of conduct, unquote, in which Israel had deliberately obstructed aid and power supplies and detonated so much explosive power on a tiny enclave equivalent to more than 2 nuclear bombs that water, sanitation, food, and healthcare systems had collapsed. The scale of the attack, it noted, had caused death and destruction at a speed and level unmatched in any other 21st century conflict. Budur Hassan, Amnesty's researcher for Israel and the occupied Palestinian territory, said Israel's actions went beyond the individual war crimes associated with conflicts. Quote, this is something deeper, unquote. Agreeing with major Holocaust and genocide scholars, Amnesty concluded that the high bar needed to prove genocidal intent in law was crossed last May when Israel began destroying Rafah, the area in southern Gaza that it had herded Palestinian civilians into as a supposedly, quote, safe zone, unquote. Israel had been warned not to attack Rafah by the world's highest court, the International Court of Justice, ICJ, but went ahead anyway. Quote, mass denial, unquote. For some time, leading Holocaust and genocide scholars, among them Israelis, have been speaking up to warn not only that genocide is unfolding, but that it is nearing completion. Last week, Omer Bartov even managed to get his message out on CNN. He told Christian Amanpour that Israel was carrying out, quote, a war of annihilation, unquote, on the Gaza Strip. Quote, what the IDF, Israeli military, is doing there is destroying Gaza, unquote, he said. Okay, and Christian Amanpour tweeted at the time, quote, It is actually a war of annihilation of the entire Gaza Strip, unquote. In a sobering interview, historian at Bartov underscore Omer tells me of his recent visit to Israel, his reaction to the IDF saying they only target uh, 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 military targets, and why his view on the question of genocide has now changed. I'm not going to play that, but you should if you go to the article. Amos Goldberg, another Israeli Holocaust expert, noted that Raphael Lemkin, a Jewish Polish scholar who coined the term, quote, genocide, unquote, described its two phases. The first is the destruction of the annihilated group, and the second is what he called imposition of the national pattern, unquote, of the perpetrator. We are now witnessing the second phase as Israel prepares ethnically cleansed areas for Israeli settlements. Goldberg added, quote, like in every other case of genocide in history, right now we have mass denial, both here in Israel and around the world, unquote. The Bartov's invitation by CNN appeared to have been provoked by an article in Haaretz, Israel's most liberal newspaper. It published last week testimonies from Israeli combat soldiers in which they describe committing and witnessing war crimes in Gaza. They paint a picture of systematic erasure that, even from their limited perspectives, looks ominously like genocide. The soldiers describe shooting dead anyone who moves inside undeclared so-called, quote, kill zones, unquote, even children, and then claiming them to be, quote, terrorists, unquote. The dead are left to be eaten by packs of dogs. The only words one Israeli reservist found to describe Israel's repeated and intentional killing of children in Gaza was, quote, pure evil. According to a senior reserve commander recently returned from the enclave, the Israeli army has created, quote, a lawless space where human life holds no value, unquote. Yet another says, units compete to see who can kill the greater number of Palestinians, indifferent to whether they are Hamas fighters or civilians. Others describe these units operating like, quote, independent militias, unquote, unrestrained by military protocols. Quote, everyone is a terrorist. How the Israeli army implemented the Gaza genocide is alluded to in the Haaretz article. After the Hamas attack on 7th of October 2023, the military leadership devolved normally centralized decision-making to local field commanders. Many of those commanders live in the most religiously extreme of the illegal Jewish settlements in the West Bank. Not only are they Jewish supremacists, but they follow rabbis who believe all Palestinians, even babies, pose a threat to the Jewish people and must be exterminated. Notoriously, a group of influential secular rabbis formalized their genocidal teachings into a book called The King's Torah. One senior commander, identified by Haaretz as Brigadier General Yehuda Vach, a settler from Kiryat Arba, possibly the most extreme of all Israel's West Bank settlements. For many years, Vach headed the military officers' training school, passing on his extreme views to a new generation of officers, presumably some of whom are now making decisions in Gaza. Today, he heads Division 252, in which many of the soldiers who spoke to Haaretz had served. One of his officers recounted how, after Hamas military leader Yahya Sinwar was killed in October, Vach held an official meeting to determine what to do with his body. He wanted to strip Sinwar's corpse naked, put it in the public square, dismember it, and pour sewage over the remains. In an address to soldiers, he's reported to have echoed a genocidal view widely shared in Israel that, quote, there are no innocents in Gaza, unquote. Even Israel's supposedly liberal president, Isaac Herzog, has said as much. But according to one officer, Vach has made this view and, quote, operational doctrine, unquote. Vach's view of Palestinians is that, quote, everyone's a terrorist, unquote. That means, given Israel's current explicit aims in Gaza, everyone must be killed. Nothing sticks. None of this should surprise us. Israeli leaders from the very start announced their genocidal intent, and more than a year ago, Israeli soldiers serving in Gaza began telling us of the systematic nature of Israel's war crimes. But like everything about this genocide, those accounts made no impact on the Western political and media consensus. Nothing has stuck, even when it is the soldiers themselves documenting their atrocities, and even when it is Israeli Holocaust experts concluding that these crimes amount to genocide. It has been more than a year since the ICJ, comprising more than a dozen internationally respected judges, decided, I think there were 17 or 18 internationally respected judges in that group, weren't there? 16, right? Because some of the votes were 16-0. Decided that a, quote, plausible, unquote, case had been made that Israel was carrying out a genocide in Gaza. The judiciary is among the most conservative of professions. The situation in Gaza is incalculably worse than it was last January when the court issued its ruling, but the wheels of justice are required to turn slowly, even though Gaza does not have time on its side. How is this permanent condition of mass denial possible? There is nothing normal or natural about it. The denial is being actively and furiously manufactured only because we live in a world where billionaires own our politicians and media. Do we need courts and human rights groups to confirm what we can already see quite clearly being live streamed to our devices? Only because we live in a world owned by billionaires. Do those same courts and rights organizations spend long months weighing the evidence to protect themselves from the inevitable backlash of smears aimed at discrediting their work? And only because we live in a world owned by billionaires is it possible, even after all those delays, for our politicians and media to ignore the findings and carry on as before. The system is rigged to favor the imperial hub of the United States and its client states. If you are an African dictator or an official enemy of the so-called West, the most minimal evidence suffices to prove your guilt. If you are under the protection of the U.S. Godfather, no amount of evidence will ever be enough to put you behind bars. It is known as realpolitik. Always another story. For many months, the Western media's role has been to gaslight us by pretending the genocide is something else. First, the mass slaughter of Palestinians was presented simply as a natural desire by Israel to eliminate, quote, terrorism, unquote, on its doorstep following the Hamas attack of the 7th of October, 2023. It was chiefly a story of Israeli, quote, self-defense, unquote, that conveniently overlooked the preceding decades in which Israel had driven Palestinians off their land, either out of their homeland entirely or into ghettos, then colonized the land illegally with apartheid-style Jewish settlements, and subjected the Palestinian ghettos to brutal Israeli military rule. In the coverage after the 7th of October, the Palestinians, along the victims of an illegal occupation, were viewed as squarely to blame for their own suffering. To suggest anything else, to worry that a genocide was unfolding, was a sure sign of anti-Semitism. Then as the slaughter intensified, as Gaza was leveled, hospitals wrecked, the population collectively punished with an aid blockade, the official story changed. So a new narrative was advanced of international efforts to reach a ceasefire, ending, quote, the cycle of violence, unquote, of the focus on securing the release of the hostages of Hamas intransigents. We were back to the familiar framework of an intractable conflict in which both sides were to blame, though, of course, the Palestinians more so. Now, as it becomes impossible to continue pretending that Israel wants peace, to ignore the fact that it is expanding the slaughter, not reining it in, the media strategy has shifted once again. As the genocide reaches its, quote, stage, unquote, as the Israeli Holocaust scholars Omar Bertov and Amos Goldberg warn, the media has largely lost interest. If there is no way to both sides the genocide, then it must be disappeared. And in media land, there is always another story that can be promoted. There will always be another front page lead rather than the most disturbing one of all, in which Western leaders in the media are full participants in the live stream extermination of a people. BBC buries the news. That is the context for understanding the media's collective yawn. As the 3 genocide reports dropped one after another this month, Israel's accusations that Amnesty's report was anti-Semitic were entirely expected. What should not have been was the media's largely indifferent response. The BBC was a case study in how to bury bad news. Its flagship television news programs, the dominant news source for Britons, ignored the story completely. Meanwhile, its poor cousin, the 24-hour news channel, which draws a far smaller audience, did mention the Amnesty report, but captioned it, quote, Israel rejects, quote, fabricated, unquote, claims of genocide, unquote. This is a tweet from Hamza Youssef. Look at the BBC News wording when covering Amnesty International's new genocide report. And she tweeted out the idea that Israel rejects, quote, fabricated, unquote, claims of genocide. In other words, when the BBC did offer very limited coverage, it skipped the news story of Amnesty's findings and went straight to Israel's predictable, outraged reaction. In an investigation for Drop Site News last week, Guardian columnist Owen Jones spoke to 13 current and recently departed BBC staff. They said the corporation's coverage of Gaza was heavily skewed to present Israel's actions in a favorable light. In a WhatsApp chat for senior BBC Middle East editors, correspondents, and producers, one participant, incensed by the, quote, fabricated claims caption, wrote, quote, FFS, it's an open goal for those who say we're that is afraid, of upsetting the Israelis and keep on couching our stories in, unquote, Israel says, unquote, but narrative, unquote, unquote. The BBC's website, by far the most influential English language online news source, inexplicably ignored the Amnesty report for 12 hours after the embargo was lifted. Richard Sanders tweeted, Amnesty's verdict that Israel is committing genocide in Gaza. currently appears nowhere on the BBC's main news page. Then he tweets, finally, the BBC will have received embargoed copies of this. Why on earth did it take them 12 hours? Amnesty accuses Israel of genocide against Palestinians in Gaza. Israel denies the accusation, saying it's defending itself against Hamas attacks in accordance with international law. That is such bullshit. Even then, it appeared as the seventh item. For the following week, it was not concluded in the Israel-Gaza index on the website's front page, making it unlikely it would be found. The pattern has long been true in the BBC's coverage of Israel and Palestine, but has become far more glaring since the stakes were raised for Israel by its genocide. As Jones's investigation discloses, BBC management has tightly restricted control over the Gaza coverage to a small number of journalists known to hew closely to Israel's view of events, and despite their editorial role provoking what Jones calls a, quote, civil war, unquote, in the BBC newsroom. Notably, Jones did not publish his investigation in The Guardian, where there have been similar reports of staff indignant at the paper's failure to give proper weight to the genocidal nature of Israel's actions. Rigged algorithms. What the BBC has been doing is not exceptional. As soon as a light is shown into the dark recesses of the state and billionaire-owned media, the same picture always emerges. Last week, an investigation revealed that Meta, the company that owns Facebook and Instagram, intentionally rigged its algorithms to suppress reports from the biggest Palestinian news sources after the Hamas attack of 7th October 2023. Palestinian news outlets saw their views on Meta platforms fall significantly after the attack, on average by 77%, when they should have expected to see far greater interest. By contrast, views of Israeli news outlets rose sharply. Paradoxically, the investigation was published by the BBC, though notably the research was initiated and carried out by the staff of its Arabic news service. Also last week, more than a dozen whistleblowers from Deutsche Welle, Germany's equivalent of state broadcaster, the BBC, revealed to Al Jazeera that a culture of fear reigns in the newsroom when it comes to critical coverage of Israel. Similar reports from whistleblowing staff have exposed the rigged nature of the coverage, always in Israel's favor, in other major outlets from CNN to the New York Times and the Associated Press news agency. In reality, the same skewed news agenda can be found in every newsroom in every corporate media outlet. It just requires whistleblowers to come forward and for there to be someone willing to listen and in a position to publish. Why? Because a genocide unfolding in plain sight cannot be made to appear normal without an enormous expenditure of effort from institutional media to close the eyes of their audience, to hypnotize us into indifference. Too many of us are susceptible to this process, and for a number of reasons, in part because we still trust these institutions, even though their chief function is to persuade us that they are there for our benefit, rather than the reality that they serve the interests of the larger corporate structures to which they belong. These Western structures are invested in resource theft, asset stripping, and wealth concentration, all, of course, pursued at the expense of the global South and the war industries needed to make this pillage possible. But also it is part of our psychological makeup that we cannot sustain attention on bad news indefinitely. To watch a genocide unfold week after week, month after month, and be unable to do anything to stop it takes a terrible toll on our mental health. It keeps us in a permanent state of anxiety. The corporate structures that oversee our media understand this only too well, which is why they cultivate a sense of powerlessness amongst their audiences. The world is presented as a baffling place where their inexplicable forces of evil act without any comprehensible causation to destroy all that is good and wholesome. The medium suggests international affairs are little different from a game of whack-a-mole Whenever the good West tries to solve a problem, another evil mole pops up its head, whether it be Hamas terrorists, Hezbollah terrorists, Syria's former dictator Bashar al-Assad, or the mad mullahs of Iran. With this as the framework for the Gaza genocide, audiences are left sensing either that what is happening to Palestinians, however horrifying, may be deserved, or that investing too much concern is a waste of energy and time. Another crisis will be along in a moment equally demanding of our attention, and so it will, because that is precisely the way the corporate media works. It offers a conveyor belt of bad news, one bewildering event after another, whether it be another disgraced celebrity or murdered schoolgirl or an outbreak of war. The media's role, the reason states and the corporations keep such a tight grip on it, is to stop us from gaining a wider picture of the world, one in which our hands look far more bloodied than the, quote, terrorists, unquote, we sit in judgment on. One where a powerful Western elite, its corporate empire headquartered in the U.S., runs the planet as nothing more than a wealth extraction machine. And so we, the publics of the West, shrug our shoulders once again at, quote, man's inhumanity to man, at, quote, the cycle of violence, at, quote, the barbarians at the gate, at, quote, the white man's burden, unquote. Nearly 15 months on, the Gaza genocide has become entirely normal. It has become just another minor routine news item to be buried on the inside pages. Except, of course, among many in the alternative media here. We still talk about it. We still stream about it. We still exhibit it. We still confront it. I'm not reading now, by the way. We still confront it. We still feel it. We still empathize with it. We will not leave it until it stops. And then we will remember it for years and years and years in order to prevent the tolerance or the normalization of another genocide ever taking place. We will try for never again once more. We failed in our first vow to never allow it again. But we will do everything we can to try to keep a new vow of never again when this genocide finally ends, as I hope it will, with a conflagration of Israeli air bases introduced by Iran within the coming days. I will check out your comments now before I move on to anything else. So Evelina says, I see we have even fewer people now. It must have been too painful to face the genocide. We're down to 8 people. Here's Evelina. So we wait for genocide to be unequivocal before something is done about it. It is disingenuous and cruel. It is. It is totally disingenuous and cruel. The wheels of justice do not deliver justice, because in a case like this, they grind entirely too slowly while people die and die and die and die. And there is no help until the patterns of power in international relations develop to the point where someone, through force of arms, can stop this particular genocide. Okay, I don't know whether Dee has been able to start her stream, which I think was scheduled for 9 o'clock. But I will see if she has been able to start it. She doesn't seem to have been able to start it. I have no indication that it's on. I will see. If it hasn't started, I will just continue on with the stream. If not, I will go over and help her. No, there's no indication. There's no indication she started. So, I'm going then to continue on with the third item in this stream. Third item I had in mind for tonight is on, the national debt. That's an item that appeared some time ago. From the Peterson Foundation. I've been kind of saving it. I decided to handle it tonight. Here it is, the announcement of the national debt reaching 36 trillion, 86 billion, 94 million, and roughly 116,000. That was announced by the Peter G. Peterson Foundation, which published an infographic about it. They said the national debt is more than 36 trillion. What does that mean? This was last updated November 22nd, so it's more than a month since then. But as of today, the national debt was $36.190 trillion as of 12/26/24. So that's the official figure as of today. And in their announcement, the Peterson Foundation says, the gross federal debt of the United States has surpassed 36 trillion, although the debt affects each of us. Does it really affect each of us? How does it affect each of us? I wonder how. Can they explain how it affects each of us? It may be difficult to put such a large number into perspective, they say, and fully understand its implications. The infographic below offers different ways of looking at the debt and its relationship to the economy, the budget, and American families. The 36 trillion gross federal debt includes debt held by the public as well as debt held by trust funds and other government accounts. In very basic terms, it can be thought of as debt that the government owes to others plus debt that it owes to itself. Is the debt that it owes to itself really debt? From one part of itself to another part of itself? Okay. Is that really debt? It's not the same kind of debt. So why lump it into a single total? That's one question you might ask. America's high and rising debt matters because it threatens our economic future. The COVID-19 pandemic rapidly accelerated our fiscal challenges, but we were already on an unsustainable path with structural drivers that existed long before the pandemic. Putting our nation on a better fiscal path will help ensure a stronger and more resilient economy for the future. How does the high and rising debt actually threaten, our economic future? Why should we take that statement at face value? Let's go through some more of this. There's $7 trillion in intra-government debt. Okay, for example, the debt that the Treasury Department owes to the Social Security program. I think that's something like 2.8 trillion already. Anyway, there's 29 trillion in debt that is held by the public. The public, of course, includes the public in foreign nations, debt owed to foreign governments. In other words, our debt instruments held by foreign governments. So they're trying to give us different perspectives. 36 trillion is roughly the value of the economies of China, Germany, Japan, India, United Kingdom combined. Well, I don't think that's the case in purchasing power parity, because if we measured it in purchasing power parity, I think that China's GDP is already higher than our own. I don't know if it's higher than the 36 trillion, but anyway, why is it important that the debt is roughly the value of the economies of all these nations combined? And why is that important? It amounts to $274,000 per household, or $107,000 per person, okay, in America. Well, why is that important? Does each of us actually owe that debt? Is that a legal debt, okay, of each of us? Now, there are many of us who have large debts and who owe many thousands of dollars. We may owe those dollars to other people, to banks, to mortgage companies. Those are debts that we legally incurred. Did we, each of us, legally incur, including newborns, did each of us legally incur $107,000? How did we sign up for that debt? How can we be held responsible for that debt in court? If every household contributed $1,000 per month towards paying down, the national debt, it would take about 23 years to pay off. Well, that's a very interesting example, meant to strike terror in the hearts of every U.S. household. But what if, say, for example, if the government were to issue $1,000 a month to every household for the express purpose of paying down, okay, the national debt. Is that something the government could not do? I mean, the government just issued stimulus payments, okay, of thousands of dollars. I mean, it didn't issue $1,000 a month, but it had no difficulty in issuing stimulus checks of $1,400 and $1,200 and $600. It just issued those checks. So why would it have a problem issuing checks of $1,000 a month so that people could use that thousand to pay down, okay, the national debt? Now, just how would they pay down that national debt if they got that $1,000 a month? Well, the government could tax them the $1,000 it previously issued in order to pay off the national debt. It could do that. Okay. But why would it do that in the first place? Why would it issue $1,000 and then tax $1,000? An even better question, why would it tax the $1,000 rather than simply pay off that $1,000 a month itself? $1,000 a month per person, okay, itself. Why wouldn't it just have the government do that? Why wouldn't it, for example, ask the Federal Reserve to issue that $1,000 a month per person to the Treasury Department and then mandate the Treasury Department to use that $1,000 a month for every household here in the United States to pay off the national debt as it falls due? Why not do that? Could it not do that? Is it beyond the powers of the federal government to do that? Of course it's not beyond the powers of the federal government to do that. We've seen the government do things that are more silly than that. Rising debt can harm our economy and threaten opportunities for every American. How does the rising debt, the rising national debt, I agree, rising personal debt can harm our economy and threaten opportunities for every American. There's no argument about that. But how does the rising national debt harm our economy? Well, I guess they're going to answer it in this infographic. $36 trillion is enough to cover a public 4-year degree for every graduating high school student for 106 years. Well, sure, it's enough. Why can't the federal government just issue 36 trillion to people to cover a public 4-year degree for every graduating high school student for 106 years? Is that beyond the power of the federal government? No. Within 10 years, the federal government will spend more on interest payments than it traditionally has on research and development, infrastructure, education combined. So what? Are you telling me the federal government can't afford to spend that money on interest payments if it so chooses? It can't afford to issue the money? The Congress can't order the Federal Reserve to give that money to the Treasury Department so that it can pay the interest? Of course it can. I showed a graphic a couple of streams ago where I showed you 2 sentences of what it would take in legislation for the Congress to order the Fed to issue the money to pay off the national debt as it falls due. One sentence was about issuing the money necessary to cover deficits. And the other sentence was a command to the Federal Reserve to issue the money needed to pay off the principal and the interest on the debt during the time of the appropriation which was involved. So why is that a problem? But we are spending nearly $3 billion per day on interest payments on the debt. So why is that a problem? Why is it a problem? The good news, says the Peterson Foundation, that there is still time to adjust the course. There's plenty of time to adjust the course, but we could adjust the course tomorrow. Just have the Congress order the Federal Reserve to issue the money to the Treasury Department to make the interest payments on the debt and to pay the principal on the debt as each debt falls due. And he says, and the earlier we get started, the easier it will be to fix. Well, I take issue with that. It doesn't matter when the Congress tells the Federal Reserve to issue the money to the Treasury Department to pay down the national debt and the interest on the debt. It's just as easy tomorrow as it would be 5 years from now, as it would be 10 years from now, as it would be 20 years from now. And just as easy as it would have been 20 years ago to do that, or 40 years ago to do that. There is no difference in difficulty in the Congress ordering the Federal Reserve to issue the necessary money to the Treasury Department to make those payments. So they want you to feel free to share this infographic on Twitter. I suppose I should share it all while I criticize every line of it, because it is incredibly stupid, and I think it's willfully stupid, because I think the Peterson Foundation knows damn well that based on Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, the federal government can issue all the money it has to issue to pay off the national debt as it falls due. I mean, the Peterson Foundation cannot know that, cannot not know that. This is one big lie. This infographic is one big lie, because it assumes that people, rather than the federal government, have to pay off the national debt. It suggests implicitly that each of us in our households are going to have to pay it off, and that it is our obligation to pay it off. It is not our obligation to pay it off. It is the obligation of the government to pay it off. And the government can pay it off because it's given the authority to pay it off in the Constitution. Not that the Constitution says pay off the national debt, but the Constitution does say that U.S. dollars can be issued by the federal government at will. Of course, it does that in the context of coining money, but notice we have a platinum coin law which allows the executive branch of the federal government to issue coins with face values as large as they need to be to allow for the repayment of the national debt. The national debt is $36.19 trillion, I said earlier. Well, the federal government could issue a $100 trillion coin, which would more than cover the size of the national debt. It could issue it. It could be credited by the Federal Reserve. That would replace the coin, or that would place in the accounts of the Treasury Department that $100 trillion, which the Treasury Department could then use to pay off the national debt as it falls due. That's all that it would take. With $36 trillion in national debt, building a sustainable economic future becomes more challenging. No, it doesn't become any more challenging, because the government can always create the money needed to pay off the national debt as it falls due. Doing that is never more challenging or less challenging. It doesn't matter that the interest we pay on the national debt is now the fastest growing part, okay, of the budget. But if it bothers the Peterson Foundation, then why aren't they coming out in favor of the proposal of minting $100 trillion coin so that that debt can be paid off as it falls due each day without issuing any more debt instruments? Could it be that the Peterson Foundation secretly wants us to continue issuing debt instruments? Is that what it is? Is that why they don't understand? Anyway, I'm not going to do more, okay, on this stupid infographic, except to note that it is propaganda to get people thinking that the only way the national debt can be paid off by the United States is for the United States to pay it off by reducing spending or by increasing taxes. It's all about getting people to think about, to only thinking about, one, the national debt is a big terror we all should be concerned about, and the only way we can pay it off is by decreasing spending and increasing taxes. And that point of view pervades the thinking about international relations of most people in the field of international relations. This includes the mainstream press, but it also includes the alternative media, where experts in international relations believe that the United States is encountering a tremendous fiscal crisis because the national debt is $36 trillion now. These supposed experts and supposed authorities, and I really don't mean to say supposed on them, people like Colonel McGregor, Jeffrey Sachs, hundreds of people we could name, in the alternative media, are convinced that part of the international crisis which besets the United States this day is the fact that we owe $36 trillion. I'm going on record as saying that is not part of the crisis. We can generate as much money as we need to fund anything we have to fund in relation to the international crises we face. And for the people to say that that is part of the crisis is to misunderstand the fiscal power, okay, of the United States to sustain the stupid and evil things we are doing in international relations. And it's important that all these experts recognize that there is no fiscal problem in this, and that we have to stop doing the evil things because we have to stop doing the evil things. We don't have to stop doing the evil things because a fiscal crisis will prevent us from doing these evil things. That is not true. It's a damaging lie because it stops people from fully facing the fact that our government has the fiscal power to do all the evil things that it wants to do. And we have to stop it from doing those things, not for fiscal reasons, but because those things are evil and they are inappropriate because they're evil, unacceptable because they are evil. We in the United States don't have to stop the genocide going on in Israel. because we can't afford to keep supplying the Israelis with arms. We can afford to supply them with arms as long as we can either trade for those arms or we can manufacture those arms. And believe me, when it becomes harder to trade for it because people are not going to want dollars as much as they do today, then we can manufacture the arms here domestically to commit all the genocides we want. Committing the genocides is not a fiscal issue. The crises we are encountering here in the United States are massive crises of inequality and injustice in our society. And all that the idea that we are constrained, that we are fiscally constrained, is doing is stopping us from ending the injustices, because in our domestic politics, there are so many people saying we cannot afford to end the injustices that we see. We cannot afford to end the inequality we see. We cannot afford to have a Green New Deal. We cannot afford to solve the climate crisis. We can afford all these things. And we can afford all the bad things too. And we have to stop doing the bad things and start to do the good things. Start building the safety net that our citizens need and that they deserve. Start building the infrastructure that we need and that we deserve. Start to educate people in the way that they and we need and that we deserve. Start building the better world that we need and that we deserve. We have all the fiscal power we need, to do that. And we need to start doing that right now and going forward. Evelina says, it's convenient to say we can't do that because of the national debt. They even blame us for the genocide by continually saying it's done with our taxes. It isn't done with our taxes. Our taxes don't pay for anything, because in the settlement process, our tax money is destroyed. New money is then issued by the Federal Reserve to do the various things our government does, including support of the genocide in Israel. Evelina says, by constantly repeating the taxpayers are funding the government. Yes, even Bernie Sanders, who knows better, keeps repeating the taxpayers are funding the genocide. The taxpayers are funding the government. At least he keeps repeating the taxpayers are funding the government. He does want us to stop the genocide, but I don't think he's saying the taxpayers are funding the genocide. But he might well say that any day now if he hasn't already said it, because he's constantly talking about the taxpayers funding everything, instead of trying to educate people to the fact that taxpayers fund nothing. The taxes don't fund spending. That what taxes do is they drive the value of the currency, and they are disinflationary. There are other things they do too, but those are the two primary things that they do. Taxpayers are necessary, but they don't fund the government. What funds the government is the Congress appropriating funds for the government to spend. That is the Funding Act. And if you ask how the money gets into the Treasury spending account, it gets into the spending account through credits that are issued by the Federal Reserve under the authority that Congress gave to the Federal Reserve when it created the Federal Reserve in 1913. And that power was the power to issue the currency and the power to issue reserves and the power to order coins from the Treasury Department. So, what I wanted to call out here, what I was most interested in calling out, was my colleagues who comment on international relations and international crises, constantly pointing out that part of the crisis facing the United States is the level of the national debt. No, that is not part of the international crisis that is facing the United States. The crisis facing the United States is the policies we constantly pursue to maintain ourselves as the hegemon of the international system. That is the crisis. If we change that policy so that we follow new policies that support the coming into being of the multipolar world, if we support the evolution of the multipolar world, our current international crisis will end. That's all we have to do to end that particular crisis. Now, once the multipolar world is fully here, and we are no longer attempting to be the hegemon, then we're going to have competition with the other members of the multipolar world in our various regions where the great powers are dominant. We will have competition in our region. The Chinese will have competition in their region. The Russians will have competition in their region. The Indians will have competition in their region. The Brazilians will have competition in their region, and so on. These great powers will be in competition in their various regions. And we will have to manage a balance of power politics in such a way that there is an evolution eventually to a world government. Because that is the only way in the end that we will be able to stop international conflicts. If we have a world government which is stable and viable and also sustainable. And we may be 100 years away from that. And we have to go through the multipolar world before we get there. And even after we get there, there will still be conflicts. Because conflict is a part, of our nature. It is the natural order of things. And we're going to have to continue to face that. Even when there's a world government, there are going to be disorders all around the world caused by injustices, caused by human frailty, caused by greed, and caused by evil. Hopefully, a world government will be better at facing those injustices than our national governments are today. But we will always have conflict. We may not always have wars because the world government may be able to stop those, hopefully. But as I say, it'll probably take us 100 years to get to the world government. When I was young, I didn't think it would take us 100 years. I thought we could be well on the way to a world government. Around 1970, I thought we might be well on the way towards a world government 20 to 30 to 40 years down the road. But looking back on those years, I see that I was entirely mistaken. And I now think it will take far longer, okay, to get there. John B. says, best wishes for Christmas and the holidays. Maintain the rage on Gaza, Joe. Peterson Foundation is irresponsible. 3060 cash can be injected into the world economy. It would destroy the U.S. consumers' buying power. Well, we wouldn't be injecting 36T of cash into the world economy all at once, John B. We would be injecting the 36T in cash as it falls due. By the way, the 36T in cash was cash that had already been injected into the world economy. And it was used by people who had the 36T to buy those treasury bonds. The 36T is the face value of the treasury bonds that have not been paid back. So the 36T existed before at various times, and it can be paid back again at various times. And just as the existence of the original 36T wasn't necessarily more inflationary in the world economy than anything else, the retirement of that debt will not be particularly inflationary if it is done as it falls due. Evelina says, apparently India just surpassed China in population. Yes, it did. It surpassed China in population because China has been using birth control and legislation to limit the amount of children in China, and India has not. So now the Indian population surpasses the Chinese population. But guess what? The Chinese have lifted 800 million of their people out of poverty. And the Indians have not done anything near that. I don't have a comparable figure for India. I'm sure it's reasonably substantial, 100 million or 200 million. But nowhere near the 800 million. How many people have we lifted out of poverty? I haven't checked the poverty statistics, of late, but we've got a lot of people in poverty. Probably, I would say probably 100 million people are in poverty right now, according to our definition of poverty. And you could argue that our definition is too conservative and that there are a lot more poor people than that.
Do you think that's because of we don't have free education?
No, I think it's because we've allowed inequality in our country, to develop. We've allowed a social structure where there are many, many poor people and relatively few people who are rich. Now, of course, the absolute numbers of rich people in the United States are now enormous. I don't even know, how many millionaires, there are, but I wouldn't be surprised to find there are 800,000 millionaires, or a million millionaires. I didn't say billionaires. What I said, was millionaires. But there are probably 1,000 billionaires now. But many, many, many millionaires. I can't even estimate that because, look, here in the Washington area, the prices of real estate, are inflated. So I don't know how many millions of people here in the Washington area are millionaires just because they own a house. So there's that. Okay, I think we're done with the comments and done with the stream for tonight. I don't think Dee was able to have her stream due to technical difficulties. I hope she'll be back towards the end of this week. Regardless, I will be back on Saturday, okay, at 9 o'clock with another stream, most probably on international relations. Thank you very much for coming. And I hope to see you all again on Saturday. And have a very good couple of days until that time. I'll see you then.